one onto hearing stream 9, dealing with natural hazards and other matters, and it's the 31st of March. My name's David McMahon. I'm the independent chair of the hearings panel, and I will just ask my fellow colleagues to introduce themselves because you weren't here in the morning session. So starting with you, Brian.
Brian Jefferson, representing South Wairarapa.
Craig Bayer, Marsden District Council.
Brian Della, Carter District Council.
Kia koutou. Kiriana Ahau, Kiriana Sims, representing Ngāti Kahungunu Wairarapa.
And if you could just introduce yourselves for the record, Mr. Jerling.
Certainly. I'm Mark Jerling. I'm an architectural designer and technologist from Masterton.
Yes.
20 odd years.
Yes, I'm Michael Hewison, a local civil structural consulting engineer, just having an honours degree in civil engineering from the University of Canberra with a double major in fluid mechanics and structural analysis, structural design, structural mechanics, and a Master of Business and Administration, Technology Management adjunct from La Trobe University, Melbourne. So the relevant parts of that are in the Technology Management adjunct, which I studied environmental management, project management, and engineering risk management, which I see as
I can only go so far. I'm a alumni of Canterbury University, so
okay.
You've left me well behind, although I did manage to make it down to Otago to do a Masters in Planning. So now just from the officers team, you might all know Ruth, who's the hearings administrator. She's been holding us all together. Wave out to Ruth. And I'll let Bronte and your witness introduce her.
I'm Bronte Langorn. I work for Bottomless School and I'm a consultant planner to council and the reporting officer for the Natural Hazards chapter.
Hi, I'm Nicola Litchfield. I'm a geologist at GNS Science, did the agricultural report.
Okay. And this morning, as indicated, we were able to put a number of questions to both Nicola and Bronte about their report and their summary statement, which I understand you've both seen. And this afternoon, we've heard from a number of submitters, including Brookside Developments and Andrew Duncan on this very issue. So Duncan, in terms of a fault hazard and less so liquefaction, the Brookside's more on a flooding issue. So we'd like to finish by 4 o'clock if we could. So the floor is yours. What we're interested in, two things, is your concerns and the relief that you think is best matched to give effect to those concerns. In other words, what is the decision that you want this panel to make?
Right. Thank you. Mr. McMahon, my concern deals with the fact that both the earthquake mapping as well as the liquefaction mapping has errors. And unfortunately, those errors add substantial cost to individual landowners, because every single time a potential client has to go to council and wants to develop their property, residential properties in Greytown is what brought it on for me on the liquefaction side. You see that council automatically goes, right, we need a geotechnical report because your site is subject to moderate liquefaction. And every report shows that there's no liquefaction potential for any of those properties. So this gets repeated over and over and over at substantial cost every time. So the mapping is wrong. And what we necessarily want to address in that is that the mapping should be amended and corrected. There really should be no moderate liquefaction zone covering the whole of Greytown. If anything, there might be small parts of it that would have low liquefaction potential, but certainly not moderate. I was a bit concerned when I read Dr. Litchfield's statement, where she appears to confuse what I'm saying about liquefaction versus earthquake, because I'm talking about the two things, but I'm certainly not talking about them in confluence with each other. I'm not sure exactly how much detail to dig into with the liquefaction, but the report that the maps were created from, the GNS report said, for instance, on page 53 of the GNS report, sure if we can pull that up, I can just read it out.
We have it in front of us. We have it.
None of these areas are expected to experience damaging liquefaction, and the lack of observed liquefaction during the 1942 Masterton earthquakes. The vicinity of Masterton, which has been assigned MM9, supports this contention. Basically, what the report writers did was define liquefaction risk mostly on the basis of the location of river channels, except that they seem to define those channels very wide. And then, of course, back behind all of this is 1,635 boreholes, which are irregularly distributed over the whole Wairarapa Valley. And that seems to be all the data that's been used to determine where liquefaction areas should be mapped. Now, there's obviously areas down near Lake Wairarapa where there are higher risk, that are at higher risk from liquefaction, but even there's been some reports that we've obtained, which is on the bundle of evidence that we've provided, that show little or no liquefaction potential. So the gist of all of this is that every single client gets lumped with a few thousand to perhaps $30,000 worth of bill to determine that there's none when a map shows that there is. And to me, that's just wrong. I think what could be done is that we could have, much like they have in Canterbury, a map system whereby which every time a geotechnical report is undertaken, that it is a public map that everybody can access for particular properties, and that we can create some form of gridding to therefore extrapolate from that so that we can see where there really is liquefaction potential rather than this great amount of guesswork. I'm not sure if I should add anything else on liquefaction. Do you
No,
think that sums it
you
up?
speak and then I'll,
Okay.
Before you move off liquefaction and onto fault hazard,
Yes.
I just need to let you know that the recommendation of the 42A officer has been modified in the summary statement. Were you aware of that? And as it affects liquefaction rules?
The one that talks about was it that I don't know if I'm looking at if I was looking at the right statement, that the one that talked about light versus moderate. Have I misconstrued that?
Well,
You might want to remind me.
yeah, again, please correct me if I've got this wrong. The old Rule 9, which is now renumbered Rule 7, would have required of activities and buildings within the moderate and low hazard areas to go straight to a discretionary activity. Okay, fully discretionary. Are they right so far?
Yes.
Modification now is to carve out permitted activity or residential activity within the possible liquefaction prone zone. So that's the low hazard area. and to have as a restricted discretionary activity within that same liquefaction area, non-residential activities.
Correct. I do remember now reading that.
And then all other activities that don't meet the permitted or restricted then become discretionary. So it's quite a nuance to the rule that was quite blunt to start with and didn't reflect the difference between residential, non-residential, and low and moderate and high. So we've got a recommendation for a more nuanced rule dealing with liquefaction. Now, does that go any way towards alleviating some of your concerns?
Does insofar as the low areas are concerned, but I think that's all it addresses, doesn't it? It doesn't address moderate, does it?
Let me just double.
It's not it's not a permitted activity in moderate, right? For a residential house.
No, it remains a discretionary activity.
Yeah.
Can I clarify though, the possible liquefaction prone area is only a low hazard, so there's no category from moderate or high at liquefaction. So the proposed district plan mapping just adopts this one category,
Only low.
Yes,
only low.
took me a while to realise that too.
Ah,
Yes,
Whereas the previous mapping and maybe the current building consent mapping that is
Yeah.
uses high, moderate and low.
yes.
More than that. Four categories.
Oh, so something like, so just to clarify that, yeah, so
Yes.
this means under the district plan,
yeah,
a residential activity in this low, well, it's called possible liquefaction prone area,
But it's,
permitted.
okay. And there's not going to be, are you saying, to understand correctly, Greytown will no longer be a moderate liquefaction area or below?
So under the district plan.
Yeah.
The mapping will just have a low category. There'll be no moderate or high.
Right.
But the extent of that compared to what you're referring to the previous report,
Yeah.
I'm not sure on how that matches up.
How that's going to overlap.
Yeah. So,
so the previous rule, Mr. Durling, was lumped all the hazard sensitive areas and associated buildings in the moderate and high together.
Right.
Clarification now is that liquefaction areas are never going to be any more than low. And so that dwellings will always be permitted.
Okay, well, that problem goes away quite nicely.
Yeah, I'm going to dig that a bit more when I have a turn, so.
I would just say don't look a gift horse in the mouth, Johnson. I mean, that's the recommendation at the moment.
So I just want to make sure I understand precisely what that means. I'm a bit of a detail person at times, so.
Sure. So that's a good news story.
Mm,
You want to move on to the fault hazard matter?
I will do, sure. When I first started looking at the fault hazard thing, what struck me and what started me off on this escapade of trying to learn more about this without having any qualifications in the line of earthquake engineering is I was standing on a client's property in Greytown, in the Woodside area, where I've designed a number of houses for a number of clients. It happened to be on this supposed new Woodside fault. And it dawned upon me that fault line, as it's being shown on the mapping, follows a river channel that runs over all of these properties. And that made me wonder, am I seeing a river channel or am I seeing a fault line? And of course, the first question is, how would I know that it's not a fault line? The short answer is I wouldn't, but I certainly do know what a river channel looks like. So I'm immediately suspicious of this fault line, not the whole thing, because I think if we look at the way that the GNS report is written, as being the report that Dr. Lichfield has reviewed, the way that report is written, it talks about unknowns and area on the eastern side of that Woodside fault. So the area that I see as river channel is certainly on the eastern side of that fault. And I don't know if the various report writers have been to those sites yet, whether they've investigated more fully, but to me, it seems that we're placing an extraordinary high demand on the LiDAR data as opposed to actually looking what we see on the ground. The Featherston fault then became an interesting one, the Eastern Featherston fault. And that's where I learned more about, once I started talking about the Woodside one, Mr. Hewson told me about the Featherston one, which Dr. Ian Brown has said is, in his view, certainly not a fault line, but displaced fan alluvial material. And again, when I then read the GNS report that underlies the fault mapping, I saw that the GNS report said that that Featherston fault may very well be of fluvial origin, and therefore it was clear to the GNS report writers that they were dealing with a bit of an unknown too. So what started off on the GNS mapping as a low hazard area, and forget me if I use the wrong words, then becomes a high hazard area by the time it gets onto the council maps and for the whole thing. So immediately I again started to think, well, how do we do this? How do we get from low to high when we go from a report to a map, when clearly the map is underlying the map is created off the report? And then I started digging a bit more and I started reading up about this, and I found myself reading the Wairarapa Times Age back in June 2022, where they talked about newly discovered faults that were discussed at the Greater Wellington Regional Council Civil Defence Emergency Management meeting on Tuesday, 31 May 2022. And there they talked about the new faults, and they talked about how these faults were determined from LiDAR data. And they then went on to say that they would, before we know anything more about these faults, we'll have to do an in-depth GPR study, which is ground penetrating radar, and that this would be nice and easy to do because GNS Science has got a newly acquired GPR machine, and therefore the resulting profiles could be analyzed to determine whether these really were fault lines, and that this could all be done without having to dig trenches as yet, and that they would then, after that, look into talking to the local iwi as well as to affected landowners to ensure that trenching could be done to further look at what the GPR data shows, overlaying the LiDAR data, and therefore make actual informed decisions. And it dawned upon me that we now have a brand spanking new map that hasn't done any of that. So we've moved straight from the LiDAR to the mapping.
We put a lot of those questions to the Litchfield this morning, Sterling.
Yep.
And to Mr. Lincoln. And what we were told was three things: that the approach to hazards, whether it's fault or flood or whatever, is risk-based approach. So it's about the identifying risk and the different levels of risk. And it's also has a precautionary element to it, which is what the national direction that's been set by the government. And in the draft national planning statement on natural hazards, the precautionary approach is one that's emphasised. That's the first point. The second point is told that the operative plan identifies only three traces or three fault lines. And that's a function purely of the data that was available, the money that was available, and the information that was available at the time back in 2005, 2006, when the combined plan was proposed and made operative in 2010. Thirdly, we've told that the approach here to identify fault hazards is unashamedly desktop, that LiDAR is the gold star in terms of identifying potential, which equates to the risk approach, and that the districts have had to prioritise their spend on this investigation, and they've focused on the areas that have the greatest population and the valley floors where there's more likely to be development than, say, on the hills and ridge lines.
Yep. And
that's become the basis for really the delineation between the FAZ and the FAA. As to the delineation within the FAZ as to low, high, or medium, that's based on matters such as return period, likelihood, as well as the LiDAR data. So the panel is satisfied that the methodology that's been conducted by GNS is fit for purpose within the confines of those assumptions and methodological constraints. It's led to a matrix of fault hazard and in terms of the risk, low, medium and high, and the sensitivity of the activities determining the activity status. And so generally as you move from, you've got low sensitivity of an activity and low probability, you're dealing with permitted, but as you go out,
Yep.
the activity status increases. That's the fault hazard. For the alert areas or
Avoidance.
fault avoidance areas, sorry. Need to make sure I don't conflate the flood alert areas and the fault avoidance areas. That's where there is a probability of greater than 50%. And that's in line with the risk-based approach. It triggers, in the notified sense, it triggered to a blunt discretionary activity status for everything. And we've got some more nuanced rules in that now. So that's what we heard this morning from the council. So certainly, as I indicated to you outside the hearing, certainly there's no, and I think Dr. Litchfield would testify to, there's no substitute for on-ground testing, but the cost associated with that is high. And so based on the risk-based approach, the fault avoidance areas are identifying a process to which development, particularly habitable dwellings, must go through to make sure that the risk is not real and has consequences. And that's generally a low level consent. Where the risk is more defined, then the activity status varies depending on the level.
Correct.
So that's information that we have as a panel.
I do understand where this all comes from, and I've looked at the document that comes from the Ministry for the Environment, which explains in tabular form how these risks are set. But, at the same token, we're dealing with, as example, houses, and most buildings in New Zealand are designed around a 50-year structural lifespan and a 15-year lifespan for replaceable items such as roofs, cladding and the like. So you've got a house that structurally, in terms of the building code, has to last for 50 years minimum. But some builders, you do wonder whether they see that as a 50-year max, but anyway.
We also had the benefit of an attendance from the building consent lead from South Wairarapa. Amelia Lincoln.
Yes.
And she took us through how building consents are assessed in terms of liquefaction and fault.
Yes.
The difference between LA1 and LA2 structures. The message from her very clearly is that building consents are highly unlikely to be declined based on this information.
Right.
If the consent is to be declined, it's going to be a land use or subdivision consent that's going to be declined based on the activity.
So are you saying a client who has a fault line running over his property will still be able to build on his property?
What I'm saying is that the building consent isn't the panacea.
Right.
That there's a real desire from the council to extend their risk-based approach to activities, not just buildings.
Right. I mean, the thing that struck me from all of this, and again, I'm not an earthquake engineer, but you look at the Wairarapa fault, which apparently has ruptured 6 times in the last 7,000 years with a recurrence interval of 1,230 years plus minus 190 years, then we're due for our next big one at 2,895. So, it's not going to be my problem or yours.
It's hard to argue with that math, isn't it? But things, and I know I'm repeating myself, the risk-based approach, national direction.
Yes.
We're dealing with risk here, but also the definition of effect in the Act includes one of low probability but high potential consequence.
Yep.
And that's what's driving the council here in terms of particularly the FAA.
Yep.
The other option they have in front of them is to not have an FAA in the plan at all, rely solely on the building consent process. We're hearing from Ms. Ludkins that that's not going to cut it. It's highly unlikely that the building consent process will be effective in controlling and dealing with that risk.
Yep.
So all sort of doors point back to land use controls in a district plan.
Look, where I'm going with this is that we know that apart from 4 faults, the LiDAR has reinforced what we already knew.
Sure.
And therefore, the LiDAR has shown us more clearly, I think, in many respects, where these fault lines run. If you overlay the old mapping with the new on the district plan mapping, there's not a huge difference for the majority of faults. But the reality is that you're sitting with 4 new faults.
Well, 4 faults that were previously unidentified, not
faults that are previously unidentified.
and probably would have been identified had that technology and information.
Correct.
And that's
correct. So the LiDAR has given us that information. But we have on the one hand Dr. Ian Brown, who is a very experienced engineer, who has done 2 reports now for properties on the eastern side of Featherston, and he is highly doubtful of the so-called East Featherston fault being an actual fault. So at the same time, as I said, the eastern end of the Woodside fault, which is one of these 4 new faults, there's also, of course, that area up in Cashmere Oaks, which I'm not going to narrow in because I've done absolutely no reading on that. Or
very familiar with that site.
I've not tried to familiarize myself with it, even though I have a client up there. I know nothing about that area, so I'm not even going to try. But where I'm going with this is, if you look at textbooks on this sort of thing, for instance, paleoseismology by James P. McAlpin, which I'm sure Dr. Litchfield is familiar with, the approach in the rest of the world, specifically America, seems to be that we start with LiDAR and we then build upon that and we do our GPR testing and we do our on-site testing and walk around, and then ultimately we do trenching, which, as I said, the newspaper report talked about, hence the discussion with iwi and landowners, which was it would happen. And once that happens, then we know that this is a fault. So we've got this risk-based approach, as you say. The LiDAR tells us it's a fault, but it may not be. And how are we going to resolve that for these 4 new faults? Are we going to say, well, that's not the council's problems, that becomes the problem with the individual landowners, and they're going to have to front up to do the trenching and do the GPR investigations? Why should that be the landowner's cost, is where I'm going with this.
Yep. It's a question I'm not able to answer.
I know.
But what I would say is that the panel have to consider these matters under section 32 of the RMA.
Right.
And so the test there is, are the provisions appropriate? And appropriate is referenced by being effective, efficient, and we have to be mindful of the risk of acting and not acting. So the risk of not acting in this case would be not to have an FAA layer and to rely on other mechanisms to deal with it. Now, we've already heard from Ms. Ludkin that she's not going to be of any assistance to us, and that's it puts the onus back on some form of land control. And then we have to decide whether the land control is effective in meeting the risk-based approach based on national direction, and is it efficient? And by efficient, are the activity classes the most appropriate? Are they setting the bar too high, like non-complying? And already, and it's something I only learnt today, Ms. Lincoln has recommended the reduction in non-complying activity status for fault hazard in the high hazard area.
So, yeah,
For activities in the high hazard.
hazard sensitive activities in the high hazard area where reports
previously non-complying, now recommended to be discretionary, so there is a consenting pathway. This will happen 3 times, so let's just take a wee break.
You just wait.
Yeah, it's best to.
I just have one more thing that I want to touch on before.
Sure. I'm not trying to refute your arguments. I'm just trying to get you to understand what, as a panel, what the tests are that we need to apply. This is the second call out in the last hour. Doesn't bode well.
Hopefully it's not at Narwee.
We'd have it out by now.
Might be a car accident. This will be the last one. Right, you should be good to go now.
Okay. Just lastly, in Dr. Litchfield's evidence, she said for the 2022 active fault study, no, we did not review bore log data as we don't consider bore logs to be relevant to mapping active fault traces. I just want to clarify that I never said anything about borehole data in relation to earthquake fault.
Okay.
The borehole data comments were to do with the liquefaction, of which, as I said, there was 1,635 boreholes that we used liquefaction mapping. That is
So that clarification.
me.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to your colleague.
So I'd just quickly like you to please summarise, you said Amelia Lukens was here from South Harbour District Council this morning. So what did she say?
He explained how they're processing buildings at the moment that are affected by hazards, particularly liquefaction and lateral spread. That they're working off maps that are old maps because the current maps don't have any legal effect. She said that it's just be careful. She said something along the lines that it's unlikely or highly unlikely that any building consents would be declined in a liquefaction zone. The emphasis would be on the structural integrity and foundation design of the building to make sure it's fine for both. She talked about L1 and LA1 and LA2 buildings, which is the habitable dwellings, and can't remember what the LA2 is. Russell, do you know LA2?
Can I?
Yeah. Sorry. IA2.
IL.
IL.
IL1 and IL2.
Oh, yeah.
So
Sorry.
IL1 is outside of the liquefaction.
Yeah.
IL2 is your normal domestic house and
Yes.
And
Yeah.
encompasses quite a few others.
Sorry.
Yeah.
IL1.
IL importance level.
But she left the panel with a distinct impression that the Building Act wasn't the solution to dealing with this. It would, from a structure point of view, it would assure that the building had a proper foundation, but it wouldn't deal with the activities that were in the building itself. And that was a land use matter that was best dealt with through the district plan.
Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about what I perceive as the disconnect between the planning and the building consent. So I'll just quickly, because we're quarter to 4 and you want to go by 4 o'clock. So I pretty much spend all day, every day on the pointy end of the stick. So I'm trying to put code together and people together and make things happen. So Andy Duncan phoned me after he spoke and he told me, I think he left you a copy of one of the tables out of NZS 1170 part 0 or part 1, which is the recurrence interval.
Yes.
And so therefore a 50-year, which is a typical building consent house, they're important too. And so wind, I have to design for 1 in 500 or an AEP of 1 in 500, and it's the same for earthquake. So that if you're looking at an earthquake with a 2,000-year return period, then, you know, you got to ask a question. But anyhow, I'll get back to it. So the only reason I'm really talking about the earthquake fault trace hazard initially is that I did a soil test in Harrison Street in Featherston. So that's immediately to the west of where Brookside Development spoke to you this morning. And he's on a lower terrace down in behind the dam, the Donalds Creek Detention Dam, and this is just slightly to the west of that, up on a rise. And so what had happened is, in the meantime, the mapping or the revised GNS mapping for earthquake fault trace hazard came out. You know, the other one was there all the time. So Andy Duncan ended up with one under his house. I live southeast of Carter, and I've got one under my bloody house now as well. So I had Ian Brown look at that, and he said, well, Mike, there might be something there, but we'll have to get, you know, it'll cost you some money now. You'll have to dig a trench. So I think I'm probably going to end up making myself do that. And I'm lucky that my son-in-law is a contractor with trucks and diggers. So I'll have to talk to him and find out where that happens, because I think I'm in the FAZ rather than the FAA, which is a bit of a bugger. And it's so where I am is that north of me is where the old Carden clay brick and tile dug their clay out to make clay bricks and clay tiles, and there's a hole in the ground immediately on the north end of my property. But my house is on a little clay knob. I had a bore dug recently last year for water just down in front of my house, and that went down 22 metres. I'm sucking water out of an artesian layer at 19 metres. There were two other artesian layers at about, I think, 12 or 14 and 16 metres. They weren't that deep. Pretty much no sands, touch of peat, but down deep. And then I had to double case my bore down to the first artesian layer because you get leakage up the side. So what happened is I got an RFI from South Wairau District Council, said this house is in a fault zone. You're not qualified to design the foundations or tell us. And so you'll have to get a geotech engineer. So I got Ian Brown involved, and he came back and said, you would have read that. And he said, no, that he reckons it's, you know, the two fans of the Taraniki River and Borbush Gully, and that it's erosion along the edge of the fan. So I've read Nicola's stuff, and it's about a fold maybe, which seems to be mentioned differently in the MIMBY guidelines a little bit. And then there's another guy on Hickson Street who had land that he wanted to sell. And so he said, oh God, well, you know, at present I'm nobbled with this. So I said, Ian, look, I need a more detailed report. They did that. And so you've seen all of that. And it's a no. So now that gets to the problem in that the planning maps, and I'll touch more on that when we get to liquefaction and stuff. So the planning maps are showing that it's a fault trace hazard, and it's said that it is. The recurrence interval might be well outside what's nominated in the code, the design code. And so I've got a report that says you're okay, and the house has been built. So here there's this huge disconnect that on the one hand, you've got a planning map that's saying A, and you've got something else that's saying B, and work goes ahead in the belief that there's no fault trace hazard issue there, but there might be a fault trace hazard issue there. One of the things that Andy phoned me and he said, look, I forgot to say this, Mike, and I said, well, I'm going to mention it. This is the property rights and the surprises that people, like this stuff ends up on their title. So Amelia, I don't know whether she talked about section 72 and all of those things out of the building code, but you end up with that on your title, and the planners will be able to tell you about that. So then if you go to sell your property, or one day an insurance person goes stalking around, suddenly you may have a problem that you have no idea about until bang, you get clobbered. So if these things are truly true and they're real, then I think there needs to be one hell of a communication process. But up till now, and like I said, when you look in the code here about the annual exceedance probability, and we've got something that's outside of that, and with a whole lot of unknowns on it that's not proved, you know, my mind is saying, ooh, hang on, this is sounding pretty bad. And I brought Saturday's Dom Post down and Luke Malpass. So the headline on the front page is, the idea here is that any level of government, especially councils, will need to carefully consider regulations and that rob private property owners of value. Otherwise, they will have to pay for it. So there's some big stink issues there that are going on. And so I understand the precautionary principle because I'm a member of the Waihini Action Group.
Yes.
We wrote the living plan for the Waihini River after a plan came out that showed 80% of grey down underwater, and we said that's bullshit, and we proved that. So I'm really aware of the precautionary principle. We went through the whole climate change thing with the late Dr. Brett Mullins. So I'm concerned that it's being applied because there is a risk, and when I read greater than 50%, 51% is greater than 50%, 49% is less. But there's a difference between 49 and 51 is only 2 units, which is not much. So my head's saying, oh, hang on, shouldn't we have a bit more information before we really interfere with people's property? That sort of seems a bit problematic for me. And then, like, one thought I had, well, we do have EQC, and all of us here probably drove here in our car or whatever we came here, and we've got insurance and that. So, and we all know that there's a risk that we could be killed in a car accident when we leave here later on. And so we've done something about that. Whereas this, people don't know about it. They've got EQC because of it, but we're still going to whack them with this. So I do have some issues with that, and it's really related to that one. And I know, and so in here in Nicola's thing, and where she says Nicola Litchfield expert evidence recommendation. So the one about the Featherston one, there's a commentary there. I recommend fault complexity should be taken into account for the WCDP fault hazard areas as per my overview group comments 21 to 27, which is in another document, but there's the recommendation column's not filled in, whereas all of the others, no changes recommended, no changes recommended, no changes recommended, and this is on page 19. So I'm sort of just struggling a little bit with that one. I really think that having been through like I say, the climate change stuff, and I never put in, well, I didn't put any submission in, but flooding, and just coincidentally, while you're looking at that, I went to Featherston on Saturday morning because the regional council had an open day last Saturday morning and the Saturday before about flooding in Featherston. So I took a whole swag of drone photos down to them, because I've done work on that area and I know how the flooding happened and whatever, and I've got a copy of their stuff here. So Brookfield Developments, it wasn't flooded, and he's probably showing you a copy of that. So I'm quite familiar with some of that.
That happened just before, didn't it?
Yeah, and you've probably seen that.
And we heard from Mr. Brown from the Greater Wellington and Dr.
Andy Brown. Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've got to bump heads with him a little bit about some stuff in Greytown and the flood hazard and whatever. We
talked about community consultation, so it's good to know that it actually occurred.
Yeah, so we did extensive work. So we really, and we had a modeller from Christchurch who really did a good job. So we sorted all of that out.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess so I don't know how or what that means, but I do have a grave concern that like I said, I'm a little bit of a detail person, and when I went to university and studied engineering, then the lecturers there said, well, engineering is a science and an art. So I can see that's potentially, like, I know soils and that stuff is really a bit of black magic and some of that stuff, but I just can't help feeling that there seems to be a major decouple between planning and risk and building consent and risk, and I'm not sure that that's proper or fair. And I think you did say some words like fair and equitable, and it's really like the Rating Powers Act and cost.
Appropriate, efficient and effective. Yeah.
So these issues are really real, and I think they're not being glossed over, but the precautionary principle. So I often talk about the compound interest effect. You don't know quite exactly what's going on, so you just add a little bit of care onto that. But then you hand it over to someone else and they add a little bit of care on it and someone else adds a little bit of care on it. So suddenly 100 becomes 1,000, just through that pure compound interest effect. So that's something that bugs me. And I think this is a bit over the top. So I can probably, the liquefaction stuff, well, you will have seen everything there. So, and Amelia Lukens is famous for that. So I can go back to the planning. So the issues really are GNS did a report, and they've got low, medium, high and very high zones for liquefaction. Tonkin and Taylor have done a report that almost mirror images the GNS report, not quite. It's slightly less restrictive and I think slightly worse than others, but it really follows just the soil maps of supposed sediments. And so you will see I've had wags of reports done by Ian Brown, because again, depending on how you view the rules and regulations, you might need a CPENG geotech engineer to do the report. So I just get them to do that if it's medium, high or very high. I was formerly the engineering manager at Shell New Zealand. So we did a major work between the BP and Shell terminals on the BP site at Seaview. We had Gavin Archer of back then Connor Wagner, now AOCOM, I think, and Gavin's well retired.
Oricon.
He would do all of our reports, and so we had to do soil remediation there because of liquefaction. And then you'll all be familiar with the Te Papa site where they did soil remediation because of liquefaction, and the same with the Cape Tin. We did it differently from that with vibroflotation, and then I talked to the guys from Miyamoto, and all they do is auger holes and fill it with stones and have it as a drainage column, which that didn't sit too well with me. But anyhow, so a guy wanted to subdivide down at Lake Ferry. So I said to him, well, look, from my point of view, I would want to do soil augers. Well, I won't get Ian Brown to do it. Soil augers and CPT testing, so cone penetrometer testing, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And some of that with a piezo head on the probe to check water pressure levels, etc., underground. So he came back. And that's how we did it with Shell, with Connor Wagner. There was always CPT and bore logs. In more recent times, and following Christchurch, well, every man and his dog got a CPT tester on a little digger or something and zoomed around and pushed it into the ground, and then sent the results to someone, and they zapped up a report, and well, you're okay or you're not okay. And that happened. So the reason I sent you the RDCL report, so there's two reports for a site south of Martinborough.
Notice that.
And then I became involved because someone wanted to build a house on one of the sites, and they said, oh, Jesus, Mike, look at the bloody requirements for the foundations. So I did some scalar testing, and then I sent it all off to Ian, and it came back that no, and then I got him to write extensively about the RDCL report. And there's clay there. Like if you go south of Martinborough, there's clay on that, well, a lot around the Lake Ferry Road. The clay doesn't liquefy. And so these people are getting really hung with these sorts of inaccurate mapping. So this one at Lake Ferry, it said, oh no, there was one of the areas question mark, but the rest of it, no, it wasn't liquefaction. Following the, I've got about 4 sites in the Kahutara area and one at near Waihinga Bridge, where I'll go to a TC2 foundation. So most of them, if you go relocate house on piles, then just piles whacked down to the hard, because it's typically always hard there. That's TC2. Where the rib raft one beside the Jenkins dip, so Brian will know precisely, which is the Osborne farm. That we went to a TC2 rib raft foundation, so it's just a bit more steel and slightly thicker in case it wanted to tear apart. But in all of Ian's reports, he gives me the results of the liquefaction in the 1855 earthquake, where there's a few spots. So there's a couple at Greytown down near the Popawai area, so around the confluence. Now you won't build there because it's really good quality flood there. There are 2 on the Moroa Straits between Greytown and Featherston. They're on the western side of that strait, so it's stony as all hell there. So Ian said, well, it's probably a gravel boil because there's not a lot of water in that area anyhow. It's quite deep. I've reviewed the Tonkin and Taylor stuff. They did some work for the Taurua Council area, and then they've sort of got a draft quick comment in there. And GNS also talk about, well, if the water table's about 4 metres down, and you haven't got a liquefiable layer, then you're probably okay. Ian talks about a 12-metre overburden. So where I have a real issue is the mapping of the GNS is always too high. And it's just, even the Tonkin and Taylor, like you have seen a more recent report where they've come back with liquefaction possible, and Ian said, well, no, it's nil to minor. Now, again, I really, so building consent authorities believing all of that, and going through, and you don't need special foundations, which I would be pretty confident about anyhow, and liquefaction, you know, people all know all this. You need loosely placed fine grained materials, and you need water, and without that, well, it's unlikely to liquefy. So that my real issue is the mapping, because then it gets to be a problem, and it shows a low level of liquefaction in Marsden where Fagan Ford is. Now, you've seen my notes there. My son-in-law had to dig the bloody scalar penetrometer out, and it was only about 1 metre down because then gravel's that hard that. So what I would really like to do is get a copy of this Tonkin and Taylor map ASAP and see what it shows or says, so I can compare it with the GNS, low, medium, high and very high, because I've got quite a few reports where it's high, but it's clay, and Ian has said, well, you don't have to worry about it. And he's talking about the 500-year for residential. Now, I've heard what you've said a little bit about how you've revised it a little bit, and residential IL2, well, no, actually only residential is somehow excluded. So I guess I need to understand that a bit more as well, because this is problematic. And so I had one person was quoted $35,000 plus GST. They wanted to extend their house, and their father wanted to build a house. So they happened to have a bore right there beside that house. I just sent all that stuff to Ian, and he came back, no, it's okay. That it's a pile foundation, so just driving piles, and that was okay. So this potentially, there's a lot of bullshit goes on, and there's a lot of people that don't really know what they're doing. And so I've seen reports where people have said, well, you've got good ground, but no, you haven't got good ground, and then you'll need to dig 800 out and recompact it with hard fill. And I know 99% of the ground's hard there anyhow, and all you'll be doing is dig it out, good stuff, and chucking it away and putting more good stuff in. So my issues really are around the maps and how accurate or inaccurate they are or aren't, and the fact that any of the medium areas, I haven't found any that where liquefaction is an issue. Like, you go through a bit of topsoily, clay, silty stuff or whatever here, and then bang, you bloody hit gravel. And it's only down the central spine that you're likely to get soft stuff, because it's where this quiescent flow and you know, sediment laden water flows down the bottom of the hill and sits there and just flutters out like a feather in the air, and so it doesn't compact itself well. If it's in a high energy river, it'll compact itself pretty well, and it's hard as hell.
Ewanson, I'm going to have to stop you there.
I know you're past 4 o'clock, so and you want.
I just want to provide a brief summary of where I think you are, Mr. Gillington. So this is my understanding based on what you and Mr. Ewanson have said. In terms of liquefaction, the fact that would always be no worse than a low hazard risk now means that dwellings will be permitted. And I think I saw some relief when you heard that.
So that's low hazard from a planning point of view, isn't it?
Yeah, that's all we need.
It's going to be used by the building consent people. Oh, I do, like I said, I do have an issue with that disconnect and the gap.
We don't have any control over that,
Mhm.
the jurisdiction.
Oh,
But-
can you write low in large letters? So when the building consent people see it, oh, everything is low hazard, that's it.
Johnson, just conscious of time,
Sure.
going to give a direction to the 42A officer to put in writing an explanation about this change, about the liquefaction possibility issue and the not surpassing low hazard. Yep.
I don't understand.
Okay, I'll come back to you on that.
Yeah.
I'm also going to ask the building consents manager, Lee, to put in writing the comments that she gave to us. A couple of other things.
Do we get a copy of that?
Yes, it'll all be shared publicly. It'll all come in as part of the reply statement. Just come to that in a moment. Mr. Julinson, on the fault, so that I understand where you are on liquefaction, on the fault hazard areas. Where are you on the FAZ and the FAA now?
Well, I guess, yeah.
I know the question to Mr. Julinson. You've had your say, Mr. Julinson.
So
No,
not for me.
no, Mr.
Oh, you said Mr. Hewison, that's all. Julie.
Yes.
Juling.
Sterling.
Juling.
My concern remains around those 4 new faults. I'm not sure where we're going to go with that, but while we're only going off LiDAR, clearly we are lumping property owners with unnecessary cost, I feel, in many cases.
Okay, so the 4 newly identified
Correct.
faults that weren't in the ODP and are in the FAZ. Where are you with the FAA?
Just remind me, what is FAA?
The fault
Avoidance area,
Awareness area,
awareness area.
awareness,
mainly rural.
mainly the rural area.
Yeah, I don't have too much of a concern. It just comes down to cost, really.
Okay. Thank you both.
Thank you.
The process from here on in is that the officers will present what's known as their reply, having heard all of the evidence over the day. Put that into writing. We'll direct some questions for them along the lines that I just indicated. And that reply will come in 3 weeks' time. Be posted on the webpage. And then the committee or the panel will get together to consider that and deliberate on the matters. And then we'll issue our decisions along with all the other decisions on the plan in one hit. And that'll be around September, October of this year. And once those decisions are issued, they become appealable to the Environment Court. And there'll be a 30 working day period for any appeals to be lodged to the Environment Court. But we finish our involvement once we issue our decisions. We become what's known as functus officio. We no longer have any useful purpose in the process.
Sure, you'll be pleased to be done with it.
Well, it's been a long process, Mr. Durling, but an enjoyable process too. And it's happened reasonably quickly in the scheme of district plan production. This all happened largely within a year of the notification, which is quite quick for councils. Thank you, everyone. The hearing's adjourned.
Thank you, Mr.